Hello, hello. How is everyone? We're still in post-eclipse glow here. So where did everybody view it? Share your location in the chat because we'd love to hear if you saw it or where you were when you did see it. We're here this evening with New York Times bestselling author Kat Bohannon, whose book Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution, a myth-busting, eye-opening landmark account of how humans evolved, which was a finalist for the first ever Women's Prize for Nonfiction. The book offers a paradigm shift in our thinking about what the female body is, how it came to be, and how evolution still shapes our lives today. Kat will be in conversation with Tim Mayo. Closed captions are available. And so Kat Bohannon is a researcher and an author with a Ph.D. from Columbia University. She is in the evolution of narrative and cognition. Her essays and poems have appeared in Scientific American, Mind, Science Magazine, the Best American Nonrequired Reading, the Georgia Review, the Story Collider, and Poets Against the War. She lives with her family in Seattle. Tim Mayo holds an ALB cum laude from Harvard University and an MFA from Bennington College. He's the author of 3 poetry collections, and his work has appeared in many publications. Tim lives and works in Brattleboro and is a longtime member of the Brattleboro Literary Festival Organizing Committee. Please welcome Tim and Kat.
Hi, Kat.
Hi.
What a book.
It's glad you liked it.
Oh, I liked it very much. It's so well documented and yet written for a lay reader such as myself. I'd like to start out by quoting something that the Guardian, Kate Wormsley wrote in the Guardian on your book. Bohannon calls on her astounding disciplinary range to tell this epic tale. Her writing ripples with references from literature, film studies, biochemistry, cognitive science, and anthropology. No wonder it took her 10 years to finish. The footnotes alone, which are particularly learned, irreverent, and funny, are a masterpiece. Bohannon isn't short on ideas that will anger some readers. She is bold when she's speaking against abortion restrictions, the gender wage gap, sex essentialism. It's clear that trans women are women, and chastity laws. There's also a grungy lushness to her prose that celebrates saliva, cervical and laryngeal mucus, buttocks, and the metal tang of old menstrual blood and fat. Her shame-free voice bears the signature of someone who's explored, tested, and loved her own body and mind as a life-drawing model, poet, egg donor, academic, musician, and very nearly a sex worker. In your introduction, you talk about the Sigourney Weaver prequel to Alien and how she wants to do a C-section. Was this really your sort of the beginnings of the germ of this story, or what?
Well, I think like a lot of people with female bodies, there are many moments in my life you might call triggering for a project like this. But I will say that this was one of those moments watching the prequel to Alien, which had Noomi Rapace. Actually, Sigourney Weaver was not the main character, but yes, but this was like the younger version of Sigourney for those of you who haven't seen it.
All right.
Yeah. Well, sort of. It's actually, it's an earlier finer goal. Anyway, this is a non-important feature. Moving on, is that it just became so clear to me that I knew something that a lot of people didn't, which is that the female body is radically understudied and undercared for. And it's very much time for us to fix that. And so I kept waiting for someone else to do a book like this for a while, and well, damn it, no one did. So fine. It's not that I'm some reluctant messiah, but damn it, somebody needed to do it, you know? So I did, and it did take me about a decade. To be fair, I was doing my PhD at Columbia at the same time on only a semi-related topics because I make good life choices. And I was also pregnant a lot during that decade. This was my 30s. And I had a number of miscarriages, which is a very normal thing to have, but mine were fancy. A lot of bleeding, a lot of hemorrhage, and in and out of hospitals. So I did all of that. I have very fancy reproductive organs. And then I finally had the 2 kids, and then COVID. So a lot went down in 10 years,
Yeah.
but also it's a big project, you know, and big projects take a while.
Yeah. Yeah. So how I'm sort of I want to jump into something immediately of and that is sort of breastfeeding and the development of language. If we can sort of run,
You want those
roll
two things?
these two up, yeah. And that's mainly because I'm interested in how language one began, but also in sort of language acquisition, which I think the kind of language acquisition that happens to us today must have been very similar to the kind of language acquisition of our hominid ancestors.
Well, I mean, brains are brains are brains. And
Yeah.
so our organ
Mm,
in our heads hasn't radically changed, one
mm,
assumes, in the
yeah.
last 300,000 years. There's some data to suggest that maybe it is shrinking, which is a fun idea. We might be having some brain shrinkage. And it's not because of TikTok. It's something actually over the last century or so. However, I would say that the major patterns of development, there's no reason to think that those would be any different, whether in the brain or elsewhere.
Mhm,
So, in that sense, we know that language acquisition happens in these critical years in early life, right?
mhm,
Because there's this crazy thing that we often forget that a newborn baby has no idea what a word is. No, we aren't born with code breakers. Well, we're born with the ability to eventually break code, but like it just sounds like a sequence of noise. Imagine listening to music and having no concept what a single note is. If you don't know where words begin and end, anything that this milk beast is chirping at you in the beginning parts of your life could or could not be meaningful, you don't know. And your brain is meanwhile growing and growing and growing. So really one of the most critical things that you learn how to do then is learning how to just segment this weird mystery code that you have to somehow then begin understanding and utilizing yourself. The big thing about breastfeeding and language acquisition, it's not necessary. Let me put a big old flag in this first.
right,
You can acquire language without ever having breastfed at all in your life. We're
mm,
thinking more about the ancestors of human beings now,
right.
who certainly had no relationship with a breast pump. There was no breast pump, right? But in these early periods of humanity, 300,000 years ago, you spent the majority of your time with your mother. That's what we see in other primates. That's what we know bodies like ours tend to do. The females are primary caretakers because we lactate, because we breastfeed. And you're
Mm,
doing this for hours and hours and hours a day. If any of your audience has ever breastfed, they certainly understand what I mean by hours and hours a day and night, actually. And night, I miss sleep. Yeah, my children are 3 and 5, and I'm just getting it back.
right.
So what that means is you have the most important person you communicate with is your mother in these early phases of life, not because you're not communicating with father and other
Mm,
members of your social group, but because it's just hours and hours of close communication. And during that time, you happen to be staring up at the expressive side of her face when you're not just like nose down and just suckling, and she's cooing and communicating with you. And these are really critical periods of when you're actually learning how to parse what words are, when
mm,
you're starting to parse what bits of language are meaningful and which are not in those first 2 years of life,
mm,
which is when this critical language thing starts to happen. So I do talk about this in the breast chapter. It's not the focus of it, but I do talk
right.
about it. And again, in the language chapter.
Mm,
But the main reason I wanted to do that there is that there's been this big push against thinking that the mother plays a role in language acquisition. Because we used to be very Freudian in psych. We used to think it's all about the mother and how she screwed you up. And it's not to say that she didn't. However, in this specific case, there's this idea, like from Steven Pinker and others, that we have a language instinct. And we do, that we're born hungry for language. We're born ready to acquire it, even though we don't have, sentences in our heads, right? But there's been this disavowal of the maternal dyad, that pairing of mother and baby mattering. But when you think about our ancestral condition with all of that breastfeeding, it seems a little weird. So I just wanted to put her back in the frame. I just wanted to bring her back in the picture and say, maybe actually mom does matter for language acquisition.
Wow. I guess I'm doing that only because in this long story of going from our pre-hominid ancestors, Morgie, and the one that begins with P now, whose name
Purgatorius, that's our
Yeah.
earliest primate. Yep,
Okay.
Purgy.
Purgy, yes. And then on is that one of the things that you've said are that's sort of I think important insofar as the development of us today is this idea of gynecology, this concept of gynecology, midwifery, which you believe, I think, perhaps started with Lucy.
Well, it's not my idea. There are
Yeah.
many scientists who came up with this. I simply report it.
Right.
Yes, yes. So there is the idea that we started having midwives as early as Australopithecines. So that's Lucy, our famous furry ancestor, lived about 3.2 million years ago. Yeah. But the way that we knew it, as I say in the book and I've said elsewhere, is that we, not me, I wasn't on that team,
Yeah.
but we, science, if I can have we be science, why
Or
not? Okay. Yeah. Analyzed pelvic inlets. Remember that, again, anyone who's given birth thinks about it or tries not to think about it fairly often, but the rest maybe not. A baby isn't just something that's in you, it has to come out. It's got to come out somehow, and it's not coming out your mouth, right? So that means that the space between your pelvic bones, your hip bones is part of this big bony structure that's propping you up down there. Your femur comes in. For those of you with hip replacements, you're very intimately aware. Your femur's coming in, that ball head right there, and that hip joint, and your pelvis is like this. Well, a chimp's pelvis is more like that because she doesn't walk upright. Right? So you have this kind of big structure, and she's got a big old hole, nice wide open gap between those pelvic bones for babies to come out. Because we evolved to walk upright, and maybe for a couple other reasons it's unclear, our pelvic structure went like this to more like that. Right? And when we did that, the opening between the two kind of became this more kind of like an oval, pointy oval shape, kind of like that. But unfortunately, that happened right before our heads started getting a lot bigger. And it's not just the head, because again, the reason newborns are hideous when they're born, and we can call a spade there, they look like squashed fruit with a cone head, like what's going on, right? The reason our very adorable newborns are so ugly is because we've got the squishy bony plates. So we're able to literally kind of uncomfortably squeeze out of there. Thank God we don't remember, right? But the thing is that the shoulders, these clavicles, these bones, these right here, these are rigid. So when you're born, these aren't bending, these aren't flexible. Actually, where babies get caught most, besides the head, is the shoulders, shoulder dystocia. Because we have to come out and then we rotate in the middle of the vag after the heads come through, and then we come out just to get the shoulders through that weird opening. Anyway, so the point of all of that is that our births got really, really hard starting around Lucy. And then our heads only got bigger, which meant our births only got more difficult, which is to say that we needed help. We needed help getting these damn things out of our bodies. Not only help in the moment of birth, although that too, that's midwifery, but help on either side with postpartum recovery stuff and prenatal. Now, no one's saying that Lucy had the full kit of prenatal testing like we have today. Okay, it's more whatever a clever primate had at the ready. But like I say in the tools chapter, she may have had some pharmacology to influence her fertility. It seems some other primates do. She certainly had social practices very social primates, altering their mating patterns and having more birds, in different environments in different ways. But the whole argument there is simply much simpler. If we were crap at making babies then, and we only got more crap at it later on, and indeed we did, actually, our pregnancies and births and postpartum recoveries are longer and harder and more prone to complications than they are in almost any other primate, almost any other mammal. Like, if that's the case, well, any evolutionary biologist is going to say, well, that's your big deal. That's your problem right there. That's not a species destined for freaking greatness, okay? Evolution works literally over generations. So if your generations are hard to generate, well, good luck, sir and madam. Yeah. Yeah. So I made the claim, based on the work of others, that, then our most important invention wasn't stone tools. They helped. They were great. Lucy had them too. It definitely wasn't fire. That didn't come on board for like a million more years later. Well, after habilis, a couple million after Lucy. No, it was gynecology. That's the reason we're alive. That's the reason Homo sapiens ever came to be, because well before Homo sapiens along the hominin line, we had to find workarounds for our inherently crap reproductive system.
How much, I mean, Lucy didn't have language,
No, 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 no.
but there must have been the rudiments of some kind of communication in order to have midwifery. Do you want to talk about what you think that may be? And
Well, I took a number of seminars at Columbia, with both primatologists and over in the literature department and in psych, and we should never think of a language as human type language, human type communication patterns as something that just arrives whole cloth. It's
right,
not like boom, you're human, boom, you have literature. That's not the boom, right? It's actually going to be this really long, weird, bumpy on-ramp of communication systems in many species over time. Like even chimpanzees have a basic gestural system.
right,
They, a hand out like this going, this means submissive, right? And it means that in captivity or out of captivity, like they have those, some some communication patterns in many animals are clearly innate. You're kind of born with it. Puppies don't seem to learn how to play bow, when they put their paws down and they put their butts up in the air and wag, and it means play with me. And we humans have learned what that means too. But the wolves do that too. Like there are many things that you're born with in communication land, especially among social mammals. What's unique and interesting about humans is that we somehow evolved recursive grammar. We don't have words for literally everything. We have combinatorial patterns. We can put words together in certain ways with slightly modifying them to mean essentially an infinity of things. Just an infinity of things. The word unicorn means something weirdly, but it only means something because you and I have learned a mutually accepted meaning, right? So that's also that language is this constantly evolving social thing that never stops and changes deeply over time. This modern English thing, for example, very recent, way more Germanic back in the day, right? And I can't speak German. Anyway, so, right. So the point is simply that language happens over deep time, and it's actually, no one's able to say exactly, here's where we got grammar, or here's where we had vocal language versus not. Although some things about our throat and mouth and jaw can give us some hints, but some people think we were weirdly singing and whistling before we were talking like this. So Neanderthals may have been very musical. Who knew? Anyway, it's a theory. So yeah, so it takes a long time, and we don't know exactly where human type language starts, but we know it's human type once you have recursive grammar, once you can have an infinity of meanings.
wow.
Do you study language? Is that why you're into it?
I was interested, yes. Did some studying of language teaching, and was going to teach in France, to teach English in France, but
Cool.
it was it didn't happen the way it was supposed to happen in any case. And
Hey, I was engaged to this French Moroccan dude for a while, and I didn't marry him, but I liked living in Marseille. That was
oh
fun. It's a
yeah,
good way to it's a good way to be 21, man.
yeah, yeah. So what would you say? I mean, I've glomped onto language as being some sort of like a diving board where people can, you know, I mean, we evolve certain innate behaviors, but then we kind of can jump way ahead of those innate behaviors once we have language and culture.
Mm,
Uh,
that's right. And your original question was about how the heck did Lucy have reliable midwifery if she couldn't
right.
talk?
Yeah,
Yeah, where it's more like grunting and screaming tells you how fast the contractions are coming,
right.
which isn't that different from now. But now we have sensitive measures and we can do electrode sensing and what have you. But you can also just put your hand on a chick's stomach when it's advanced enough in labor.
Uh,
Um, and by chick, I simply mean a person who's about to give birth, which
right.
may or may not identify as a woman. Yeah, so there are things that you can know. There are definitely things that you can know without having language.
Mm,
But I think for a very long time, it was quite literally monkey see, monkey do.
uh-huh.
But you can get really complex social behaviors and even tool knowledge passed down in non-human primates today. I mean,
Mm,
there has been observation of prior generations teaching younger generations, among chimpanzees, for example, how to sharpen a kind of spear out of a young twig with with your teeth, and then use that to stab the crap out of a bush baby, and now you have a steak dinner. There have been certain kinds of rocks are better than others for pounding the nuts of this stupid tree that only comes into season once a year. Like in
yeah.
other words, there's a pretty established scientific literature among other primates
Mm,
showing intergenerational knowledge transfer, especially around tool use and around what you might call cultural behavior, right?
right.
Because tools are always about behavior. Like, let's put it this way, a paleoanthropologist does not give a damn about rocks. They know a lot about rocks. They don't
Mm,
care about rocks. What they care about is behavior. They're triangulating, the object that might be a tool, the imagined species using it, and the potential outcome in that they want in that given environment, right? Like that's every single person who studies ancient stone tools is a closet behaviorist. They just
mm,
are, and they admit it. It's just that
mm,
very few people say it.
uh-huh. Uh-huh. I'm going to just pick one question here which came up in our Q&A. Can you say more about male triumphalism and female subordination and perhaps unpack how we got here as a species?
That is a big, meaty question. Let's see what I can unpack. For triumphalism, well, it's tricky. So, male triumphalism. In the tools chapter, I talk about tool triumphalism, and I'm picturing here, I don't know, those of you who are Kubrick fans, you might
Uh-huh.
tell from my references that I am certainly a sci-fi fan. So
Right.
in that famous scene in 2001, you see a bunch of hominins like, eating stuff in a weird dusty landscape. There's a little dirty water nearby, and then they have a conflict between the groups, kind of monkey war, as it were. And then one guy, which is actually this mime in an ape suit,
Mm,
he finds a bone and he holds it up and he starts beating the crap out of the ground with it, going rah and screaming. And then you see this montage of him like beating the crap out of another guy, and this starts all war. And then like the bone gets thrown up into the air, and then the camera tracks it and turns into a spaceship. So that's tool triumphalism, right? The idea that like basically where we come from is some monkey with a bone figuring out how to beat the crap out of somebody.
mm,
That gets modified. It's not just Kubrick's fault. It was the general idea that where we come from is hunting, for example.
yeah.
And it's always a male story. They were hunting big game and we were pounding tubers or something. I don't know. We were the little lady back home, but with more fur. We were a side character, in other words.
Mm,
But the more that research has unearthed, sometimes literally unearthed,
mm,
it doesn't seem to be the division of labor really quite at all. Actually, females seem to have been involved in quite a lot of big game hunting
mm,
historically in the
yeah.
human species. We found burials with full like weaponry and regalia. We used to think those were males, but then we did some DNA testing. Turns
Mm,
out they were female, and we were like, well, crap, sorry about that,
mm,
madam. In other words, there's a revision happening in many different disciplines that have to do with evaluating our human and pre-human past about what chicks were for, right? And it seems the more and more we look into it, not because of a political motivation, but just because the data are what they are, females were equal players in hunting and social power, and just from what we can tell, it's not the story at all that hunting was exclusively male. It's not the story at all that males were going out and getting the food in exchange for monogamy or something, knowing whose kids were whose, in other words, which is a story that gets passed around at all. So how did we get here? How did we get from, to the point where it seems in many, many human cultures, but not all, many known human cultures, there's this male dominance and female submission's the wrong word. Female suffering, we should just call it female suffering, right? Because it seems that more than likely you're going to suffer in such a social structure. Okay. Sexism is another word. Yeah. I think there are a lot of ways that one could get here, so we shouldn't assume there's one story. I do think, however, that we often erase stories that we know of, not counting the huge amounts of human history that we don't know of, wherein that wasn't the story. I talk in the book about Kerala, which was a matriarchal society. There was inheritance along a maternal line and power structures aligned along a maternal line. There were a number of Aboriginal and Native American cultures in various places in the world, which is to say human cultures that just aren't a part of the story of the West that we tell, but very much a part of the human story, which were matriarchals, which is to say, I think the thing to know about the human past more than anything is that we are behaviorally flexible. Actually, there isn't one way human beings go about organizing society. We just tell ourselves that is, right? It may have been the case, as I talk about in the book, that in our deep ancestral past, we were all matriarchal and we did a flip, wherein males gained more power. And then that was the root of what we now see in many places as patriarchies. It may be that in some places that happened, in some places that didn't, because we don't know when it went down. It may be that we were always trying different things out because it's simply hard to survive, and innovating on culture is something our species just does. Which is to say, the thing to remember about how we got here is always be suspicious of historical myopia. Our species is 300,000 years old. And our known history, is a handful of 1,000. That we don't know what life was like 100,000 years ago, or 200,000, or 300,000, right? But don't assume that it looked the way it does now.
We have one more here. This one's a longie, so let me.
Okay.
Physical attributes that indicate an evolutionary trait, like our left breast being slightly bigger than our right. This is a woman, by the way, that's Susan Schmidt, indicating a propensity for left side feeding, which you talk about in the book. Are there female physical attributes that indicate violence and monogamy, like the size of testes in male species? In the book, first in womb and then later in love, it seemed that the conversation shifted to male attributes rather than female, which is fine and echoed in studies like Wrangham and Peterson's dynamic males, Just wondering if female anatomy shows telltale signs of violence and monogamy as well.
Right. So thank you, dear reader, for reading the whole book. I know it's a process. For those of you who haven't, don't worry, there's still a lot of jokes all through. You can do this. The last third or so is footnotes, and there are jokes in there too if you're so motivated. So the thing to know there is it's absolutely right that I talk a lot about male anatomy in the last chapter, the love chapter, which starts out as a basic problem set. Everybody asks me what ancient human mating strategies, and by everybody I mean a surprising number, not everybody, but like a lot of people have asked me, how did marriage go down before there was marriage? How did mating go down before? our
Mhm.
current social norms. Is there, and often it's a loaded question, right? Because there's this idea of what's natural. Because of course, whatever we used to do is supposed to be what we do now, right? But no, actually, we did all kinds of terrible, terrible things, like child sacrifice. Don't want to go back there. I'm cool with us being against that now, but moving on. So, but yeah, there's this idea that like, is there something that humanity did most of the time?
Mhm.
Well, the best way to look, again, given how very recent our knowledge of our past is, that everything we call human history is usually just a few thousand years. And we know our species is 300,000, so a little more work to do, a little more things to talk about there, and very little data to go on. Um, is that, well, and of course, you know, hominin behavior is going to shape what eventually becomes humanity. So the best place to look is the body itself.
Mhm.
The body, you know, look at the body itself and how does it compare to other species that are similar to us? How can it tell us stories about mating patterns? So that's how the love chapter starts, and then it becomes a story about the evolution of sexism. From the
Mhm.
start of it. Then we started that chapter. I did look a lot at male anatomy because that's part of what we know a lot about. We're still filling in the gaps and studying female anatomy, but we know a lot about monkey balls. So much about monkey balls, which I now know because I made that my job. Weird job to have.
Mhm.
But I do. And so there is this story where there's that relative size thing, which tells you something about mating patterns. Because it is true that if you have a lot of males, if you have a promiscuous society, a lot of males competing with one another to be the dad, as it were,
Mhm.
sometimes within the space of minutes, people, chimps are a bit lively and bonobos have an even more satisfying life, as it were. So, you know, so if that's the case, well, then you're going to have to make a lot of sperm. That's just a thing. You're just going to have really big knockers if you're a male down there
Mhm.
to generate literally enough of the guys to have a fighting chance,
Mhm.
right? So in that case, testicle size can tell you something compared to overall body size
Mhm.
about the mating strategies. And it's true that gorillas have teeny tiny little balls like peanuts, not a whole lot there. Chimps just have way more than anyone should. It's just like amazing they can walk around with those things. You know, it's like truck nuts, but way worse, you know? And then human beings, again, on average, people, we're talking about averages, big statistical numbers, not trying to elide people who have one or another side of that tail. Kind of medium size, kind of Goldilocks down there, you know, and that does tell us something at the very least about our mating strategies, and that's why I focus so much on the male. But the question was is whether or not there are parallel things in female bodies. Well, one of the things I do talk about in the love chapter is that we don't have a very complicated vagina, as vaginas go. You
Mhm.
know, it's a little bit foldy, but it's not labyrinthine. It's not cryptic. It's not the sort of thing like you might see in a species that has a lot of sexual coercion, a lot of rape. I don't mean to
Mhm.
say there's no rape. There's a lot of rape in humanity. I just mean, was that a dominant mode of getting new babies into the world? Was it so common that it would have affected the success of one body plan or another? Right? Because if you remember that the phallus is always in both collaboration and competition with its corresponding vagina and vice versa, right? That these two things co-evolve in species that have them. You can actually learn a lot by looking at the male if you don't yet know enough about the female. But knowing at the very least that we don't have a very complicated vag system tells you at least you can rule that out as a factor.
Mhm.
Unlike species that have a lot of sexual coercion,
Mhm.
we don't have that trait of a complicated vag that's trying to literally trap unwanted sperm and get rid of it when
Mhm.
we're unfortunately exposed to it, like every mallard duck today.
Mhm. What are the primary, this is an interesting question, but what are the primary objections or criticisms of your work?
Let's see. Mm, you know, it's about a 50-50
Split?
split among such people who have this as a critique. Some
Mhm.
people have it as a critique that turns into a plus, some people just have it as a critique. Um, I did my best to imagine the lives of our Eves. For those of you who
Yeah.
haven't read it, the
Mhm.
book is structured in a way where I try to name a last common ancestor of a given trait that places us where we are in the taxonomic tree. and then use that character to examine whether or not what we know rather about sex differences around this trait, if there are, and how it may have shaped our trajectory to today. So we have a chapter for lactation. We have a chapter for live birth, for eutherian placental birth. We have a chapter for our primate sensory array, et cetera, et cetera. For each of these, I sat down with Dr. Advait Jakar, who's a wonderful paleontologist, who was at the Smithsonian doing his Ph.D. at the time, then went on to Yale Peabody, and then has been about in his early career. He's one to watch. He's very clever. And he and I sat down with a bunch of takeout dumplings, actually, because I was a grad student at Columbia at the time, on my floor on the Upper West Side, and tried to figure out which species would be best as a last common ancestor. If we didn't know the direct one, most of the time we don't. It's always contentious. We picked an exemplar species. But because I know from my background, first as a poet and then as a literary writer, even outside of my scientific research, that there's something about imagining the lives of something that's so different from you. There's something about being immersed in a scene. You know what I mean? So I thought I should try and give, I don't in every chapter, but I should try and give a little slice of life for that Eve. You know what I mean? But that involves imagination. That involves supposition. That involves artistic work. And so when I'm doing those who want strict science are like, where did this lyricism come from? Why am I here? What's this based on? And for others, they would find that surprising, but then they roll with it. So that's been a thing. I've heard some more in the UK than the US, but I've heard some quibbles about the parts that are supposition. Usually, as in critique space, they then say that I do a pretty good job at flagging when I'm doing that move and when I'm not, because it's not only in the lyricism. There are other times when there's supposition. I try and say what is and isn't, but that's an uncomfortable thing in science writing. It's sort of like, what is science writing for? Am I here to simply teach you? Which, the didactic, the pedagogic. Am I here as your college prof trying to make things understandable and giving you the lay of the scientific land? Am I here as an artist to make you feel stuff, to prompt you to imagine things, to make you ask questions that you hadn't asked before in the way that artists do? And in science writing, I think we're really here to do both, actually. Not to obscure the science, but to also do both. So I think that's been a central thing that people have brought up.
Well, for my own feeling about how I think you really succeeded in this book in being able to show to somebody who doesn't have the kind of scientific background that you do, to bring it together and to bring so much of it together into a book and to create a narration of it that goes for 200 million years, is and not have the reader being stumbling over all sorts of complicated and unusual biologically technical explanations and stuff. That you do a fantastic job at that.
Thank you.
And
it was my first book, man. So I had to learn how to do that. I mean, I had almost exclusively written poetry and academic and work and scientific papers
very different
before. A few magazine articles, not many. So it was a learning curve.
We have another. As you began your research, I assume you had a feminist bias. This is from a woman, by the way. Was there something that really surprised you that supported or contradicted your original plans?
So, interesting question. The whole idea of bias. I mean, the scientific community is a community, which is to say that we are made of people. And people are always already situated in the cultures that we're in. which means that, like, whether or not you set yourself out to do a feminist work, you have ideas about the world, and they inevitably get filtered through a lens. Math can only do so much. I mean, I was a mathlete in high school, but that didn't solve my problems here. I can run basic statistics, but not extremely complicated ones, but basic. I know my way around ANOVA. But it's I if anything, the discomfort for me was giving myself the task of taking all of the sexist questions seriously for the sake of seeing what the science really said.
Yeah.
You know, that I didn't refuse any angle at
Mhm.
first because I didn't like it.
Right.
And that's part of why the book took so long. I really had to dig into the like wide arrays of literature to see what was out there.
Right.
um, you know, and so my least favorite chapter, which I've said to everybody, a least favorite writing, was the brain chapter. Because the
Really.
brain chapter, oh yeah, even though, well, there are a few reasons. One, I had training in psych and cognition, and so I felt that pressure of having a little more, supposed to
Uh,
know what I'm talking about, sorta, kind of thing.
uh,
So I felt that. That's just an academic thing.
mm,
But also, more importantly, I felt the pressure of being a woman writing about whether or not the idea that women are innately less smart might be true. I mean, nobody wants that job. I don't want that job. And I gave myself that job because it's this book. Because
uh,
it's this book. And there's no way I couldn't have a brain chapter. Because obviously, in the evolution
yeah.
of our
uh,
hominins, you have to talk about the human brain. You can't not talk about the human brain. You have
Right.
to talk about the human brain. And so I had to take every single one of those incredibly sexist ideas seriously. Like, are we worse at math? Are we more emotional or more mentally fragile? Are we, like all of that stuff? And I say it very bluntly in the brain chapter
Mm,
that I would rather jump off a cliff. That not literally, I don't have suicidal ideation. I'm just being dramatic. But, I mean, the point is that I had to do that. And so, which is to say, I had to work very strongly against this idea of bias in order
mm,
to do the best job that I could as a
mm,
person writing about science
yeah.
in the book. And so, I would just like rage write for like hours and then like go back and do other chapters when I was working on the brain chapter because it was just torturous. Because some of the science out there, the data are what they are, but you can only design an experiment in a certain
Mm,
way, and bias gets in, sexist bias goes into, some experiment design, and then you have your data, but how do you interpret it? And what do
mm,
you say in your discussion sections, which sometimes are just wild suppositions about, why girl babies are supposedly more into a certain kind of toy? Oh, it's because they're destined for grocery shopping. Like, bad science is out there.
yeah.
Bad science is out there. And I had to read it all. So
Mhm,
that was not fun. But I also saw some really good science and I was able to give the lay of the land. Yeah, so it was the opposite problem, I'd say. I was less worried about my bias getting into it and more just the labor of making sure that I was willing to report things that I wasn't fond of, that
mhm,
seemed nevertheless to be true.
mhm.
Um, yeah, it does.
Where-
It is true, for example, that we get more depression, although I knew that already.
The females do more than males.
Yeah, American women, which is true in Europe as well, are diagnosed nearly twice as often as males with a major depressive disorder. Yeah, we
Oh,
are uniquely vulnerable. We don't
wow.
know how much of it is diagnosis bias. That
Right.
thing of, do you show up in the clinic to be diagnosed because you only get your
Right.
data?
Yeah.
You can be a depressed person at home and no one knows anything about you. You
Right.
have to actually be diagnosed to show up in stats. But
Yeah.
of those who do, and likewise for men, if you never show up, well, how can we help you? You know, um, but it does seem there's something that might be unique about biologically female people and major depressive disorder. But we don't
Mm,
know what it means yet, and we don't know what part of it might be hormonal. We know that people who are postpartum have a unique
mm,
form of depression we call postpartum depressive
right.
disorder. Not everybody gets it, a lot of people do. We're only just starting to learn what it's like, though, or what might be driving it, because we're only just now finally starting to study women patients the way we should.
In the review that Kate Wormsley did in The Guardian, she talked about
Mhm.
how in Great Britain there's no change in necessarily choosing both male and female subjects for any kind of research or anything like that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit about, I mean, that was,
Yeah. So Kate Womersley is brilliant. She's going to be on stage with me actually in Scotland in May, and she was so kind as to write a nice review, which is why we're going to do the event. We like each other is the point,
yeah.
professionally.
Mm,
We didn't know each other prior to my publishing.
mm,
She so she's a part. She's a physician, and she's a part of the Message group. I don't remember what all the letters stand for, but it's a major group trying to get. Uh, Sex differences in biology better known, sex differences in medical research better
right.
covered, and not simply more done, but also done with better care and in context and the way it should be. You know what I mean? Um, so she's wonderful. It is true that we have had some gains. It's not
Mhm.
true that nothing's happened. We've had a number of gains in the US and in the UK with policy shifts, which have made a wonderful difference, but it's not big enough yet. We have to keep our foot on the pedal. Like, for example, for a long time, you weren't supposed to include women of reproductive age
Right.
in clinical trials, like you're testing a new drug,
Mm,
in the United States and in Europe too, because of thalidomide. Actually, it was because
yeah.
at one point, yeah. Many of you know, we messed up some babies without meaning to. By we, I mean the medical and scientific community
Mm,
gave women a drug that produced birth defects in their offspring. Okay, so we're like, okay, better not include anybody who might become pregnant in a
mm,
clinical trial until you know what the heck's going down. Unfortunately, since reproductive age is age 11 or so,
mm,
until like 50 something, because menopause hits that's most of our adult female
right.
lives, which means that so many drugs were coming out that had never been tested on women. But that changed. The good news, it changed in 1994 in the United States. The FDA changed its rules. But that wasn't enough because we weren't studying female rodents either in labs. We weren't studying females anywhere in
Uh,
basic science or applied. So then the NIH changed its rules and said, okay, we're not going to fund any research. I'm talking about the United States now, the
yeah.
National Institutes of Health,
Yeah.
unless it properly includes sex differences. But the thing is that the loopholes are so big. Um, you can just drive whole truckloads of medication through and indeed still do. And rules that apply to rodents, well, there are a lot of exceptions allowed for non-human primate research,
Uh-huh.
in part because of how expensive it is. So
Mm,
it's like we can do better. And so Kate and I are both trying to keep our foot on the pedal in
mm.
in saying let's not rest on our laurels. Because you know what happens when you rest on your laurels, your small gains? Well, how's that going with feminism? Yeah, how's that going with racism? Awesome, right? Yeah, you want to celebrate your wins, but you want to keep going forward.
Yeah. Um, what topics are you researching now, and when can we expect your next book?
I have to write it.
Yeah,
Uh,
right.
I know every author on book tour. When's the next one? Let me get off tour.
Sure, right. Okay.
Yeah, right. I hear my children are alive. Like right now I'm home, but I'm often not. Let's see. I'm looking into there's a lot that didn't go into the first book. It used to be 150 pages longer. So there's
Really?
that. I'm long-winded. They helped me with that. But also there was a lot about the medical side of things that doesn't go into this book. So the next book, I can't say exactly what it is till we sign on the dotted line,
Right.
but it's going to be a lot about uh, new ways of imagining health
Ah,
for people with ovaries and people who might not have them,
mhm,
but otherwise are female. So that's what the next book's generally going to be.
mhm. Wow. Um, s- okay, we have another one here. What have you learned about the effect of a male-dominated society on the development of teenage girls' brains?
Well, I talk a bit about this in the brain chapter.
Right.
Um, I would say that, well, the first thing I'd want to say is that sexism is bad for everybody. It's
Mm,
actually bad for boys too.
yeah.
There are a lot of sometimes overt and sometimes nebulous pressures on developing males to conform in ways that they may not naturally want to conform in ways that cause harm to
Mm,
them and mental instability to
mm,
them. The most obvious case, of course, is for people who are not heterosexual. It's
yeah.
actually, there's a lot of emphasis on what is or isn't masculine on young boys. So it sucks for them too. But the specific ways in which it may well suck to be female and have a developing brain when you're a teenager, because your brain is going through a lot of development, actually. You're not just a young adult, there's a massive shifts going on in the brain when you're a teenager. Um, in females is that we do a lot of social learning. And if all your social learning tells you that to be successful, you have to be a certain way, that's going
Right.
to train your brain to respond in certain ways to different settings. Let me
Mm,
put it this way. So, there's such a thing as a stereotype threat. If you do a psychological experiment where you're going to give your subjects a math test and some of your subjects are female and you expose those female subjects, not exposed like flashing, I mean, literally, that's the psych term, sorry. You give them the idea that girls are bad at math. Now, you don't
mm,
have to say it directly, although that's been tested too. You could say it directly. It could be on a poster, on a wall. It's just
mm,
like the idea's there. Like
mm,
in some point before you take the test, those female subjects will then perform more poorly on their math test
mm.
than those who had not been so
So,
exposed.
mm,
But it's not just about that, because it is, like I say in the brain chapter, it's also true that if you expose male subjects to the idea that boys are bad at recognizing emotion, they will literally be worse at recognizing facial expressions that express emotion, on a computer test, in a standard psych test, than if you hadn't exposed them to that idea, which is to say that we are so social as the animals that we are, these social primates that we are, deeply, deeply so, that our brains are very responsive to social signals, are very responsive to ideas that they encounter that have implications for our own behavior. And if that's the case, then we should not be surprised that girls' test scores in mathematics tend to plummet, but particularly around puberty. It's
mm,
not that their ovaries are making their brains dumb, okay? It's
yeah.
very likely that they are strongly responding to a social environment that tells them they're not supposed to be good at it, okay?
Yeah.
So so
Have
that's
there
one
been
major effect.
have there been any uh, studies or experiments where the suggestion is perhaps positive instead of maybe negative or something like that? Or are there any situations like
Yes.
that?
Yeah, the opposite has also been tested.
Mm,
Affirmation is super great. Yeah,
uh,
you can totally improve test scores by just making people feel good about the skill they're about to perform. And that's going to be true not simply for things like a math test score. That's also going to be true within certain limitations for like sports. It's just like it's true for you're not physically going to be stronger. You'll always have the body you have, but it just turns out that not feeling like crap about yourself lets
mm,
you do better at stuff.
mm,
That's one of the wonderful perks of being as social as we are. Positive social affirmation
mm,
does measurable good.
mm. If you were writing your book now, what would you change, if anything? I mean, besides the fact that you have 150 pages, which you didn't include.
No, I feel good about not including. I mean, the book is already
Yeah,
not short. But again, last third is notes. You can totally do this, people.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Um, I I feel conflicted about the conclusion. But I don't feel differently conflicted than I did when we
Uh,
decided on the final form of the manuscript. I mean, the conclusion of the book.
uh,
Um, You see, I wrote the last chapter, which is optimistic. You may or may not know, for those of you who haven't read the book, I'm an incredibly optimistic person for the sexist world we live in. Like, yeah, like we end on a high note, y'all. It's I wrote that conclusion or a version of it while Obama was president.
Okay.
And we were not in radical inflation, and we were not, and Roe v. Wade was, a
Still.
thing still.
Yeah.
And, there were just different things about the world. Russia hadn't invaded Ukraine. So many things about the world that are incredibly disheartening today, whether or not you're talking about uh, gender rights, the rights of women and girls, and gender differences in general. And so when Trump became president, I had to decide. I had to sit with that for 4 years. I had to decide, because remember, I had a version, whether or not I was going to.
Rewrite that, yeah.
I just had to sit in my feelings, like many of us did. We had to sit in my feelings and just live with them for 4 years. And then that January happened. And it's been a lot for Americans, no matter where you are politically. Let's just say it has not been an easy time. Okay. It has not been an easy time to be a patriot in this country. And indeed I am. So maintaining that optimism was what had to be not just a matter of my own mental health, but also I had to make sure I still believed it. You know what I mean? So I sat with it, and then Biden became president, and we all sort of shrugged. But it was better than the alternative for many of us. I know not all, but many of us. But at the very least, nobody died immediately from that, except for in DC. But moving on, I think I finally came to the conclusion that because I had been able to look at this spread of deep time, it's a weird thing to think about 200 million years.
Yeah.
Deep time does something to your brain. I mean, there's perspective and then there's crazy making, right? So, knowing that our species is 300,000 years old, knowing that hominins are millions of years old, I'm able to pull the camera back, which can be really useful for moments like this. I'm able to say, we're still on the right track for building better equality between the sexes. Actually, the evolution of the hominin line seems to show a kind of shrinking of male size and growth of female size. A lot of sex dimorphisms that you see in other species, in other words, have gradually, it's one of the classic things about our evolution, have disappeared. Yes, males are a little bit bigger than females in our species, but really not by much. Really, most of that's gone out. That's what people forget, because you see the rock and you're like, he's like the size of a sofa, on its end. He's just but most males, no, and most females are not. So Carmen Electra, not so tiny. So it's, and then when you look at sex egalitarianism, over the last 400 years, the trajectory is clear. And there's been pushback all along, It's not the case that just now is the first time there's been a backlash against, a move towards female rights. We've been having that for hundreds of years. But the 2 steps forward, 1 step back thing, it's still going. I mean, that isn't to reduce the very real suffering of people everywhere right now who are being very negatively impacted by the very real backlash that's happening globally, not just in the United States. But it is to say that we are still on the right track. It's not the case that this is unwinnable.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been quite something. I want to sort of put up your book here so that people see this, which they may have already. Here we go.
There you go.
Okay. I believe in the chat there is a way to buy this book through Bookshop and give,
Cool.
I guess, a certain piece of your of the action to your local bookstore,
Please
and
do.
they do, which is great. And this is an incredible read, and I've enjoyed it so much. And I still have the notes at the back to go through.
There are some jokes in there.
Okay.
There are. You'll see them.
All right. Kat, thank you so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you so
Kat and
much.
Tim. What's an amazing book, an amazing story. It's unbelievable. And I think everybody should read it.
And
So
thank you
our
so much
next
to
literary,
Brattleboro. Thank y'all for hosting me.
oh, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Our next literary cocktail hour will be Friday, May 17th at 5, featuring Edward O'Keefe, who is the CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Foundation, and he's the author of a new book called The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, The Women Who Created a President. We will be in conversation with historian and author Michael Cullinane. So have a fabulous weekend, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you so
Bye,
much,
y'all.
Kat. Bye.
Thank you so much, and you have a lovely evening.
Mhm.